Hey everyone, welcome to the Torah Matinee Shir. It's kind of a special edition. It's Erev Shabbos now, and but I have some thoughts about Pesach, and I needed to get them out of the way so that I could just be done with it. I had a lot of thoughts. It was a quiet Pesach, alone and at home, or what I call a home, and had a lot of time to pray, to think about the meaning of my prayers, to do a lot of learning. There's a lot of learning associated with the Hag, and so I'm going to talk about the Torah portion that we read on Shabbos, Chol Hamoed Pesach, on the year of the pandemic. It was a very, very, very good Pesach, very spiritual Pesach, and I'd like to share some of the ideas with you. There's you know, I'm not going to mention much out of the Haggadah. I was using a beautiful, beautiful Haggadah this year. It's by Rav Twersky, Rav Dr. Avram Twersky, and it deals very much with addiction issues, and he draws a connection between a slavery and addiction, that they're very much the same. And from my experience, I can tell you that that's true. That an addict will generally do anything to use drugs, or alcohol, or whatever it is, food or relationships. I've done all of them. I've done a lot of 12-step groups. I started out in Al-Anon. I had my first wife. I had problems there, and then I saw I had a drinking problem. I went, and then I went to a rehab later. Did NA to great success. Um, since I've been in Monterey, I went back to AA and spent quite a few years there. I really love the 12-step programs. Lately, I've been doing a program called Adult Children of Alcoholics, and wow, I've learned a lot there about why I do the things I do and think the way I do, and that will be flavored through this entire talk here. And so I'm not really going to speak much about the Haggadah, but there is one line here. It says, "Bechol Dover Dor," right? It says we all have a hue, and what that means is, in every generation, it's our duty for each of us to regard ourselves as though we personally came out of Egypt, right? And so it says here, you should tell your son that on this day it was because of this that Hashem did for me when I went out of Egypt, right? It was not only for our fathers, but we too, right? We were redeemed with them. He brought us out. And so this comes at the end of a discussion of the four different ways that people ask questions, and there's the one who separates himself from everybody. There's the one who just doesn't really know that much. There's the simple son. And so these are all beautiful things. And what we're going to focus on is that for each of us, there's some sort of spirituality that can come to us through Pesach, and it's an opportune time um, for us to experience some sort of freedom. It's the season. It's the season of our freedom, right? And so how does a person reach, freedom, right? And I'm going to speak about it in the context of, a new freedom and a new happiness. Um, that as we grow spiritually, we can become someone else and act differently. Overcome ourselves, and that's our test in the world. Okay, so how are we going to learn about that? So one question that really, really, really comes to mind, and the Torah portion that we read on Shabbos. Came from Beshelach. And it talked about how when the people left Mitzrayim, when we left Egypt, um, the Egyptians regretted letting the Hebrews go, and so they went after them again. Right after experiencing 10 plagues, they go after them again. It's crazy. And in that we can see a connection to addiction, right? That it has nothing to do with anything rational, that you're being driven by some sort of force that's greater than you, and it just kind of takes over. Um, when I speak, I don't speak, my own words. At least sometimes it's obvious when I'm giving my opinion, but I try to speak close to the sources, and I rely on Chazal, and they teach us to say a lot of different things, like Baruch Ata Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam Shehakol Nehiyeh Bidvaro. I never got to do that before. Okay, so anyway, so how could Paro do it? So I think a good way to look at this is I did a little bit of research, and there's this concept that Hashem hardened the heart of Paro so that Mitzrayim would get the full measure. So there was supposed to be 10 plagues, and they were pretty grueling, and so Hashem helped the Mitzrayim to go through all 10 of them. They would have been willing to lose heart, somewhere along the way, and Hashem helped them to suffer. And so the way that we'll look at this is we'll look at all of the 10 plagues, and we'll see how Paro reacted. Okay, so coming into it, right at the very beginning of the plagues in the Torah, it begins in Parshat Vayera, and in Parshat Vayera, we learn that Hashem says to Moshe that Paro's heart is stubborn. So we come into the first plague, which was blood, and at the end of the first plague, it tells us that Paro's heart was strong, right? Vayit chazak, and so he was able to stay proud after the plague of the blood, on his own, right? He had a strong heart. Come the second plague, the frogs. The Torah tells us that Paro continued to be stubborn, right? V'chach beid, right? He continued to be stubborn, and then come the lice. We learn that Paro's heart was strong, right? Vayit chazak. So on his own, Paro was able to withstand the first 3 plagues, no problem. Now come the wild beasts. Apparently it started to get a little stressful. So the Torah told us that Paro made his heart stubborn, right? Vayachabed. Now I'm working with translations here from the Art Scroll. Yeah. So then, so by the 4th plague of the beast, Paro made his heart stubborn. By the 5th plague, his heart became stubborn. This is during the plague of a plague, right? They brought a pestilence also. That was the 5th plague, and his reaction was vayachabed, right? His heart became stubborn. So by the time that we got around to the 6th plague of boils, well, boils, I guess, are just incredibly uncomfortable, and there was quite a bit of suffering along with that. So we see a change in the narrative here, where Hashem steps in. Hashem strengthens Paro's heart for him, right? So it's vaya chazek, right? Hashem strengthens Paro's heart. So now Paro can enter into the seventh plague, which is hail. And so the hail comes, and apparently Paro, was able to get his strength back. And so it says here that Paro's heart became strong again, right? Vayachabed. Come the eighth plague, we're in Parshat Bo now. So come the eighth plague, the plague of the locusts. Hashem tells Moshe, I've made Paro and his servants. I've made their hearts strong, right? Hichbadti, right? So I've made their hearts strong, and so yeah, and so comes the eighth plague. The Torah tells us Hashem strengthens Paro's heart. Vayat chazek. So come the ninth plague, the plague of darkness. It was the same thing, right? Hashem had to step in and make it so that Paro would continue to be stubborn, right? So come the darkness, Hashem strengthens Paro's heart, v'chazek, and he entered into the final plague, which was the death of the firstborn. And after the 10th plague, there was no more stubbornness in Paro's heart, and he said, "Take as you spoke and go, and bless me as well." Okay, so that's the end of the plagues, and the people leave Egypt. And so our question is, how could they even think to go chase after them again at Yam Suf? Well, in Vayer it told us Kabed Lev, right, that Paro's heart is stubborn. We learn in Bo that I have made his heart strong, right? So Hashem steps in and makes him especially stubborn. Vayach Chazek. And then finally we see the Hekzakti, that Hashem strengthens everybody's hearts for them. And then we get to Beshelach, and it tells us that the people's hearts were transformed, right? Because God said, I'm going to strengthen their hearts. And then sure enough, their hearts were strong. And they decided, we're going to go chase after the people. Right? So the heart. So I've been thinking about the heart, and there's a beautiful way to look at the heart. One thing that would be interesting to do would be to draw a connection between the heart and the eyes. And I'm going to use the same source I used in the last year. In the last year, I implied that the coronavirus came into existence because of idol worship. And that's a pretty strong statement, and I don't know that I'm going to retract it, but I am going to clarify that what it means for people in the modern age to worship idols, because we don't really, have stone idols. Or, I don't know, maybe some people do, but I don't know. It's not a thing like in the time of Abraham, where people had stone idols that they made with their own hands and worshiped them. But these days we have other things that we place between us and God, right? Our addictions, worries about money, worries about getting our jobs back or getting a new job. These kind of things take us away from our spiritual approach to life, and it's too bad. It's hard to keep a spiritual focus in this world. But I brought the Shema last time as a proof of coronavirus that if we do what Hashem wants, then everything will be fine, and uh, and He'll provide rain in its proper time. If we don't do what He says, then then we'll be kicked out of the good land that He gave us. So so I use that as a proof for coronavirus, and I don't know, whatever. But I'd like to use the Shema again today to give us a practical guideline as to how to move away from worldly thoughts and move more toward a more spiritual aspect. And so it says here in the Shema, in the third paragraph of the Shema concerning the mitzvah of tzitzit. You've seen the strings that that people have hanging out of their clothes. Well, the reason why we wear tzitzis is to remind us that that there's a higher power, and that we'll see the tzitzis and we'll be reminded of the mitzvot, and we'll do them. And so why do we do mitzvah? Well, the Shema tells us then, so that we don't stray after our heart and after our eyes, after which we tend to turn. So there's a connection then between the heart and the eyes. That the eyes feed the heart with desire. The heart can cause the eyes to seek certain interpretations that may be false. Both of these things work together to direct the feet to move in a particular direction, right? So the heart and the eyes and the feet, these three things are all tied together. And if a person can somehow either control their heart or they control their eyes, they may be able to somehow get a grip on the other thing and learn to direct their feet. Okay, so that's the idea that I'm working with here. And so we see a nice piece of advice earlier in the davening on the Leolam Yehi Adam prayer, right? It says that a person should always be God-fearing, in private, in the same way as he is in public. He should admit the truth, speak the truth in his heart, speak the truth in his heart. Because the opposite of that would be to speak falsehood in your heart. And falsehood in your heart is the thing that I call idol worship, right? That sometimes it's easier to hold on to something that isn't true or something that's destructive because it's just hard to change. And so, but just because it's hard doesn't mean we don't do it. And in some things we have an obligation, and some things we're actually required. And so the goal is then to not stray after our heart and after our eyes. So we separate ourselves from things that are spiritually harmful. Well, that's a concept that's just basic, right? If an alcoholic wants to stop drinking, well, don't go to bars. But easier said than done. Because when a person's a slave to their passions, we don't really have the ability to not, unless we find a new way of living. And I posit that new way of living has to be spiritual, that we can't do certain things on our own. And when we gain strength to break a bad habit, sometimes we snap out of it and we say, wow, I never really had the power to do that thing before, but now I do. So somehow I have the power to do what I couldn't do before. And that's a really, really good feeling. And so it comes from separation. And so we learned something really interesting in the Daf Yomi this week. We're in Masechet Shabbos, and And we're learning something that's kind of common. We're learning about we were learning about the different ways that a person can light the Shabbos lamp. Certain types of oils are forbidden. Certain types of wicks are forbidden. And they mention that as a wick, you can't use anything that comes from a tree as a wick, except for flax, right? And so why? Because we're concerned that certain types of wicks can contract contamination, right? Spiritual contamination. And so they mention that um, if you take a wick and you twist it, then it can still be susceptible to contamination, spiritual contamination. But if they take um, but if you take the wick and then you singe it, then it can't attract contamination, and you can light the shower sites with it. And even so, Rabbi Akiva says that you can light with it anyway. It's not susceptible to tumor. So anyway, what's the point of all of that, right? Is that there's there's forces in the world that are impure, and people need to protect themselves against these forces. Either you believe in it or you don't. That's just one of those things. But Jews tend to believe that there's forces in the world, and and that we need to be careful how we interact with the world. That there's various types of impurities to be avoided, and and through study, a person can learn these technicalities and actually practice spiritual distancing, right? Guarding the eyes is a very, very important concept. If a person wants to retain a spiritual basis in their core, they can't really there's certain things that just aren't compatible, and certain thoughts you just don't want jumping into your head willy nilly any old time. Um, so I don't know. It's Erev Shabbos. I can't spend a bunch of time doing this. But one thing I wanna share is that at the end of the Pesach Seder, there's a really funny song. It's a really fun song. Had Gad Yah, right? Had Gad Yah is a story about how a guy has two zuzim, and so he buys a kid goat, right? And then a cat comes and it eats the kid goat. Then a dog comes and it bites the cat, and uh, and then a stick beats the dog, and a fire comes and it burns the stick. Water comes and it puts out the fire. Then an ox comes, it drinks the water. The slaughterer comes, he slaughters the ox. The angel of death comes, and he kills the slaughterer. And then the Holy One, blessed is he, came and slew the angel of death, who killed the slaughterer, who slaughtered the ox, who drank the water, that quenched the fire, that burned the stick, that beat the dog, that bit the cat, that devoured the kid, that the father bought for two zuzim. What a story, right? It's like it doesn't have a happy ending. Like, every single person suffers, right? Right? So doesn't it all begin with the first offender, right? That the cat's the problem here, right? The cat killed the goat. The goat was innocent, and everything that came after that, they're heroes. They're correcting a harm that was done, right? They're getting even with the world. right? So when it comes all the way down to the angel of death, then Rabbi Twersky asks us, right? So what's the angel of death's problem? That he kills people. That's what he does. So why does he need to be punished? You know. And so Rabbi Twersky says here is that no one is beyond acting out of personal interest. Even the angel of death, right? The angel of death is a totally spiritual being, but he still could be acting sadistically. You know, he likes killing. He gets some kind of pleasure out of it, so he wants to kill. So he's killing because he wants to, right? You know, maybe he goes above and beyond the mission. You know, and in all of these things, anytime a person takes revenge or gets even, you know, payback, those aren't healthy things. And and a person needs to be careful of their motives. You know, we can convince ourselves that we're so holy and deep and spiritual, and really we're being selfish and vain and proud. You know, and so a person needs to be honest, right? And that's what we learn in the Siddur, right? That a person needs to be honest, uh, you know, in public as well as private, right? That hypocrisy doesn't serve any place in the spiritual world, and that Pesach is a time where we learn that we're not slaves, that God will help us, and if we want to be helped, we will be helped, and God will help us to direct our heart and our eyes towards spiritual things, and only good things. So I'll finish off on a funny note. It's an irony, and it's beautiful, and I have one of my thoughts in it. But you know, at the end of Pesach, um, one of my good friends wanted to make bread for Shabbos, but all the stores in Monterey, every single one of them, are sold out of yeast. So isn't it ironic that during our Hag of Pesach, where we don't eat chametz, right, any leavened product, we didn't have anything that contains yeast in our possession. We didn't own anything that contains yeast. And then when we leave the Hag on, you know, Pesach pandemic, can't even get any yeast. That it's like see chametz. We think of chametz in a spiritual way also, right? It's a physical thing. We don't eat leavened food, but also we don't have. We try not to have leavened thoughts, meaning that we don't let our thoughts get all puffed up. You know, we're right sized. Um, and so come to the end of Pesach. The message I'm hearing here is, David, don't let your thoughts get all puffed back up again, right? Just because yeast is allowed to you now doesn't mean that you have to have it. You can choose not to have inflated thoughts. And in fact, I'm going to force you not to, and I'm going to not let you have yeast. Okay, so anyway, that's the way I look at the world. But you know, I call them simanim, and you can't really deny what's right in front of you, and you have to pull whatever meaning from it that you can pull from it, and uh, and move forward into what comes next. Okay, Hazak. So I hope everybody has a beautiful Shabbos and that you had a good Pesach and that you're enjoying your social distancing and the ability to concentrate on the things that you like to do and hopefully you're not going too stir crazy and maybe you can get a YouTube channel and start doing silly videos. Okay, so. Right on. So after Shabbat, it's Parshat Shemini. I'm hoping that I can do another Torah matinee shir and share with you some of the things that I learned this Shabbos. And so I hope you have a good one and only good things. Okay? All right.